Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Dim the lights, pull your blanket up, and make yourself comfortable, because tonight we are going somewhere that will make your bedroom feel like a tropical paradise. And I don't say that lightly. I genuinely mean that wherever you are right now, even if it's a drafty apartment in January, even if your radiator is making that horrible clanking noise and not actually heating anything, you are living in extraordinary luxury compared to the people we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight, we are going to Yakutia. For those of you who are not familiar, and don't worry, that's most people, Yakutia is a republic in the far northeastern corner of Russia. Its official name is the Sakha Republic, and it is, depending on how you measure these things, the largest federal subject of Russia by area. It is also, by most reasonable accounts, one of the coldest permanently inhabited places on Earth. Not cold, as in you need a good coat. Not cold, as in the pipes freeze sometimes. Cold, as in the air will freeze your eyelashes shut. Cold, as in exposed skin can develop frostbite in under a minute. Cold, as in thermometers have literally given up and stopped working because they weren't designed to go that low. The town of Oymyakon, nestled deep in the interior of Yakutia, holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded at a permanently inhabited settlement. In 1924, Soviet meteorologist Sergei Abrashev recorded a temperature of -71.2 degrees Celsius. That's -96.2 Fahrenheit, for those of you playing along in imperial units. Other sources put the record slightly differently. Some say -67.7 Celsius in 1933, depending on which measurement and which station you cite. Either way, we're talking about temperatures that don't belong on a planet where anything is alive and breathing. And yet, people live there, have lived there for thousands of years, are living there right now tonight as you listen to this. That is the story we're telling. Not just the cold itself, but the people. The Yakuts, the Evens, the Evinks, the Russians who were exiled there, and the Russians who chose to stay. The reindeer herders and the diamond miners. The children who walk to school in -50 degrees. The horses that sleep outside in temperatures that would kill most other animals. The cows that are kept indoors for 8 months of the year and still somehow produce milk. We're going to go slowly. We're going to let this place breathe, because Yakutia is not just a climate curiosity. It is a civilization built on ice, sustained by ingenuity and stubbornness. And it has a history that stretches back further than most of us can comfortably imagine. So settle in. Take a breath of your warm, perfectly breathable air, and let's begin. Let's start with the geography, because without understanding where Yakutia is, nothing else quite makes sense. Russia is enormous. We all know this. It spans 11 time zones. It covers more than 17 million square kilometers. It touches the Arctic Ocean in the north, the Pacific in the east, the Caucasus in the south, and stretches all the way to the borders of Norway and Finland in the west. Russia is so large that when it's midnight in Moscow, it's already morning in Vladivostok. Within that vast space, Yakutia, the Sakha Republic, covers about 3 million square kilometers on its own. That is roughly 1/5 of the entire Russian Federation. It's larger than India, larger than Argentina. If Yakutia were its own country, it would be the 8th largest in the world. And within those 3 million square kilometers, the population is less than 1 million people. Just under 1 million people living in an area the size of a large continent. That works out to about 1 person per 3 square kilometers, which is about as close to nothing as you can get while still technically being settled. The Lena River runs through Yakutia from south to north, draining into the Arctic Ocean. It is one of the longest rivers in the world, and in summer, it is a working highway: boats, barges, the occasional tourist. In winter, it freezes solid and becomes an actual road. People drive trucks across it. They drive trucks across a frozen river in temperatures that can drop below -50, and this is considered normal. This is just Tuesday. The landscape is taiga, that great belt of coniferous forest that wraps around the northern part of the globe like a dark green ring. Spruce, larch, pine. In summer, it's surprisingly lush, green and alive and even beautiful in a cold, austere kind of way. The sun barely sets in June. The days are long and warm enough for mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes in Yakutia are, famously, absolutely relentless. We'll get to the summers too, because they are their own kind of story. But mostly, when we talk about Yakutia, we talk about the winters. The winters begin early and end late. By October, the ground is frozen. By November, temperatures are regularly hitting -40. By January and February, the coldest months, places like Oymyakon and Verkhansk are sitting in a cold so profound it has a physical quality to it, a weight and a texture that people who have been there describe with a kind of quiet awe. The cold in Yakutia is not like the cold you feel waiting for a bus. It's not uncomfortable. It is dangerous. It is a force. It is a thing that will kill you if you give it half a chance. And the entire culture of the region is built around not giving it that chance. Let's take a moment just to sit with the numbers, because numbers are sometimes the only way to make something real. At -40 degrees Celsius, which is the same as -40 Fahrenheit, because the two scales cross at that point, metal becomes brittle. Steel can crack under stress. Rubber becomes stiff and loses its elasticity. Car engines, if left outside and not running, will freeze solid and cannot be started without hours of preheating. Diesel fuel begins to gel. Ordinary lubricants stop working. At -50, things get stranger. Exhaled breath doesn't just fog. It crackles faintly as the moisture instantly crystallizes. This is called the whispering of the stars in local tradition, a phrase that is far more poetic than it has any right to be for something that is basically your lungs meeting their worst nightmare. At -60, which Yakutia regularly achieves in bad winters, you are in territory that most of the world's infrastructure was simply never designed for. Tires can shatter on impact. Concrete cracks. The metal frames of buildings contract and groan. Wood can snap. At these temperatures, the cold is not something you are in. You are inside it. It surrounds you completely, and the only warmth that exists in the entire world is whatever small pocket you have managed to create with insulation and heat. And Oymyakon, at its recorded -71.2, was somewhere beyond all of that. A place where the cold itself seems almost to have a personality. Old, patient, indifferent. Now, here is the thing that always makes people stop and think when they first hear about Yakutia. The question that bubbles up almost immediately. Why? Why would anyone live there? It's a fair question. And the answer, as usual with history, is complicated and layered and involves a combination of resources, exile, tradition, and the peculiar human capacity for adaptation. Let's start at the beginning. The indigenous people of Yakutia, the Sakha, who gave the republic its modern name, did not arrive in the region because they thought it looked nice. They didn't wander north looking for a charming place to settle. They came because they were pushed. The Sakha are a Turkic people, originally from a much warmer region further south. Historians believe they migrated into Yakutia over several centuries, likely between the 10th and 13th centuries CE, though the precise timeline is debated. They were pastoralists, people who kept horses and cattle, and they brought that tradition with them into one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Think about that. You are a pastoralist people. You keep horses. You keep cattle. These are warm weather animals, or at least temperate weather animals, and you take them into a place where the winters will hit -60. What do? You adapt. You build. You invent. The Sakha developed an entire material culture around the problem of extreme cold. Their traditional house, the Balagan, was built partially underground, or at least with earthen walls thick enough to provide significant insulation. It was low and squat, designed to retain heat, with a very small entrance to minimize heat loss. Inside, people and animals often shared space because the body heat of cattle contributes meaningfully to warming a building in -50. The Sakha developed cold weather clothing that was, in its own way, sophisticated. Fur layered in specific ways, with the fur of different animals used for different purposes, depending on their insulating properties. Boots, called torbaza, were made from the legs of reindeer or horses, which have particularly dense fur, with the hair facing outward to shed snow and facing inward to trap warmth. The design is so effective that modern researchers studying cold, weather survival gear, have occasionally pointed to traditional Sakha clothing as an example of near-optimal insulation engineering. They developed practices around the horses. The Yakutian horse is a specific breed, compact, stocky, extraordinarily cold-hardy. Where most horse breeds would die in Yakutian winters, the Yakutian horse can survive outside year-round, digging through snow with its hooves to reach the grass underneath. It develops an incredibly thick winter coat. It stores fat reserves. It is, in a very real sense, a cold-adapted animal in a way that most horses simply are not. And the Sakha selectively bred it over centuries to be exactly this. The same with Yakutian cattle, a breed developed over generations to survive the winters, kept indoors for much of the year, but able to endure conditions that would kill European breeds. This is the baseline. This is what the indigenous cultures developed over centuries of living in the cold. A set of technologies, practices, breeds, and adaptations that made life in Yakutia not just possible, but sustainable. And then, in the 17th century, the Russians arrived. The Russians came east across Siberia at a pace that is, looking back on it, genuinely remarkable. It took them less than 60 years to go from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, a journey that covered thousands of kilometers of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. They were driven by the fur trade, primarily. Sable fur was immensely valuable in 17th century Europe, and Siberia was full of it. The Russian state pushed eastward, building fortified outposts, ostrogi, along the rivers, establishing control over local populations, and extracting tribute in the form of furs. They reached the Lena River in the 1620s. They established the city of Yakutsk, which remains the capital of the Sakha Republic today. In 1632, the Russian fort went up, the tribute system was imposed, and suddenly the Sakha people found themselves subjects of a distant Tsar who had no idea what the weather was like in the place he was now theoretically ruling. Russian contact brought new things to Yakutia: trade goods, new diseases, new political structures, the Orthodox Christian Church, which gradually made inroads into the indigenous population over the following centuries. And it brought Russian settlers, some voluntary, many not, because Yakutia, over time, became one of the great destinations for Russian exiles. From the 18th century onward, Yakutia was where the Russian state sent people it didn't want anywhere near civilization. Political dissidents, religious nonconformists, criminal convicts. Later, in the Soviet era, victims of purges and show trials. Generation after generation of people who had run afoul of whoever was in power in Moscow found themselves loaded onto sleds or ships, or eventually trains and planes, and deposited in Yakutia. Far away, cold, difficult to escape from. The geography was, from the state's perspective, the perfect prison. You didn't need walls. You didn't need guards, not really. Where was anyone going to go? Oymyakon is not near anything. It is separated from the rest of the world by hundreds of kilometers of taiga and permafrost. The cold itself was the barrier. We'll come back to the exiles. They have their own stories, their own remarkable lives, their own ways of coping with a place that was not their home and that they had not chosen. But first, let's spend a little more time with the land itself, because the geography of Yakutia is not just about cold. It's about permafrost. And permafrost, it turns out, shapes everything. Yakutia sits on top of one of the thickest layers of permafrost on Earth. Permafrost, permanently frozen ground, underlies essentially the entire republic, and in many places it extends down over a kilometer. In some areas, the permafrost is estimated to be 1,500 meters deep. That is ground that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years. Ground that has been frozen since the Pleistocene, since the time of mammoths, since before human beings built any kind of civilization anywhere on Earth. The practical implications of living on permafrost are considerable and somewhat surreal. Buildings cannot simply be built on permafrost the way buildings are built anywhere else. If you build a heated building directly on permafrost, the heat from the building gradually melts the ground underneath it. The ground becomes unstable. The building sinks, tilts, cracks. There is a specific kind of architectural failure, common in Siberia and the far north, called thermokarst, where buildings slowly sink into the ground that their own warmth has melted. Yakutsk, the capital city, has entire neighborhoods of buildings that are visibly crooked, leaning at odd angles, the victims of permafrost dynamics working against them over decades. The solution, which engineers figured out over a long process of trial and error, is to build on stilts. Literally, you put the building on stilts or pylons driven deep into the frozen ground, with a gap between the building and the surface, so the heat from the building doesn't reach the ground. The cold air circulates in the gap. The permafrost stays frozen. The building stays upright. Walking through Yakutsk, you see buildings raised on these pylons everywhere. Modern apartment blocks, office buildings, even some older Soviet-era structures, all perched on their legs above the ground, with that characteristic gap underneath. It looks slightly improbable, like the buildings are thinking about going for a walk. But it works. The permafrost also complicates infrastructure in ways that require constant vigilance. Pipelines cannot simply be buried. They have to be elevated or specially insulated. Roads that are not maintained carefully can buckle and deform as the permafrost shifts. In summer, the active layer, the top meter or so of ground that thaws seasonally, becomes muddy and unstable. The ground heaves and subsides with the seasons. It is, in a real sense, alive, in a way that ground in temperate climates is not. And then there is what the permafrost contains. For decades, scientists and hunters and locals have been finding things frozen in the permafrost. Animals, plants, fragments of the Pleistocene world, preserved in cold storage for tens of thousands of years. Mammoths, most famously woolly mammoths found in various states of preservation, sometimes with their fur and skin and stomach contents intact. Woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, ancient horses. These animals died, sank into the ground, or were buried by sediment, and the permafrost preserved them with a thoroughness that no other preservation method can match. The most famous recent example was a mammoth calf found in 2007 in the Yamal Peninsula, slightly west of Yakutia, but on the same permafrost belt nicknamed Lyuba. She was about a month old when she died, roughly 42,000 years ago. She was so well preserved that scientists were able to determine that she had likely died by suffocating in mud. Her trunk was still flexible. Her eyelashes were intact. Her milk teeth had not yet been replaced by adult teeth. This is what Yakutia's permafrost does. It keeps things. It is the world's largest and most patient freezer, and it has been running for tens of thousands of years. Recently, as global temperatures have risen and the permafrost has begun to thaw in some areas, scientists have found other things inside it. Viruses. Ancient viruses, dormant for millennia, some of which are still viable. Researchers at Aix-Marseille University successfully revived a 48,500-year-old virus from Siberian permafrost in 2022. A fact that is, depending on your disposition, either extremely scientifically fascinating or deeply concerning. There's also the methane. The permafrost has been storing vast quantities of organic material, dead plants, ancient peat, carbon accumulated over millennia. And as it thaws, that material decomposes and releases methane and carbon dioxide. Yakutia is, in the context of climate change, sitting on what scientists politely call a carbon bomb, a feedback mechanism where warming causes thawing, which causes more methane release, which causes more warming, which causes more thawing. But that is a topic for another night. Tonight, we stay in the cold. Let's drift now to a specific place, because abstract geography only takes us so far. Let's go to Oymyakon. Oymyakon. The pole of cold Oymyakon sits in a valley in the Oymyakon Ulus district of Yakutia, about 750 kilometers from Yakutsk by road. The road, for most of its length, is the Kolyma Highway, which we will get to in a moment, because it has a history that deserves its own extended, quiet meditation. The valley itself is part of the problem, climatically speaking. Oymyakon sits in a bowl, surrounded by mountains. Cold air, being denser than warm air, sinks. It flows down the mountain slopes at night and accumulates in the valley floor. The valley traps cold like a bowl traps water. On still, clear winter nights, which are common in continental Siberia, far from any moderating oceanic influence, the cold pools in Oymyakon and just sits there, accumulating, deepening. This is why Oymyakon is colder than places at higher latitudes that you might expect to be colder. The North Pole, for instance, is colder on average in the sense of its mean annual temperature. But Oymyakon regularly beats the North Pole at its lowest recorded temperatures. This seems counterintuitive until you understand the bowl effect, the continental climate, and the absence of the ocean's thermal buffer. The name Oymyakon comes from the even language, the language of one of the indigenous peoples of the region, and is most often translated as unfrozen water, or water that does not freeze, referring to a thermal spring near the settlement. There is indeed a hot spring nearby, which stays unfrozen even in the deepest winter, and which gives the place its name. The spring once served as a watering hole for reindeer herds, which is part of why humans began staying in the area in the first place. The current permanent population of Oymyakon is somewhere around 500 people. Some sources say 400. Some say it fluctuates. It is, in any case, a small settlement. A few streets of low houses, mostly built along Soviet-era planning lines. A school, a small cultural center, a shop or two. The buildings are low and heavily insulated, many of them with earthen berms against the walls to provide additional protection against the cold. The school is a notable feature of life in Oymyakon because it functions as a kind of baseline indicator of how cold it is. Classes are only canceled when the temperature drops below -52 degrees Celsius. At -48, -50, children go to school. They bundle up in layers of fur and synthetic insulation. They walk through the dark. The sun barely rises above the horizon in January, and they go to school. At -52, the administration decides it's too cold even for that, and school is canceled. -52 is the threshold. That gives you a sense of where the baseline is. The monument in Oymyakon, and there is a monument because Russians have a deep tradition of commemorating extreme things with monuments, is a silver thermometer-like structure marking the location and its status as the pole of cold. There is some debate between Oymyakon and Verkhansk, another nearby town, about which is technically colder and which holds the true record. This debate is conducted with the same competitive energy that other towns might bring to disputes about who has the best pie or the most attractive main square. In Yakutia, apparently, what you compete about is the cold. Verkhansk, to its credit, has a slightly stronger claim on the historical record. It was the first place in the region to be officially recorded reaching extreme low temperatures in the 19th century, and was recognized by the Russian Geographical Society as the pole of cold for much of the early 20th century. Then, Oymyakon's reading of -71.2 came along and complicated things. The two towns have coexisted in this rivalry ever since, which is mildly charming when you consider that they are both objectively extreme enough that the difference between them is somewhat academic. Life in Oymyakon, as described by the people who live there and the journalists and researchers who have visited, has a quality that is hard to describe without sounding romantic about something that is actually quite hard. The day in deep winter is short. December and January, the sun rises around noon and sets by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. 2 hours of dim, gray light low on the horizon. The rest is darkness. The cold and the dark together create a particular sensory experience, a kind of enforced stillness. You cannot move quickly in extreme cold. Moving fast means breathing hard, and breathing hard at -50 means your lungs are pulling in air that can cause cold injury to the respiratory tract. You move slowly, deliberately. You conserve heat, conserve energy, conserve everything. People in Oymyakon do not, as you might imagine, spend much time outdoors in winter beyond what is necessary. Daily tasks that would be trivial in a temperate climate, getting water, feeding animals, collecting firewood, take longer and require more preparation and carry more risk. A car won't start after being left outside for a few hours. Engines are kept running, or they're plugged into block heaters, or they're kept in heated garages that eat money to maintain. If you need to go somewhere by vehicle, you plan ahead. You don't just pop out. There are people in Oymyakon who keep their cars running continuously for months at a time through the winter, because stopping means potentially not starting again. outdoor plumbing doesn't work. Obviously, pipes would freeze instantly. Most homes in Oymyakon have outhouses, the outdoor kind, separated from the main house. In winter, this is a brisk experience, to say the least. It is, by all accounts, the least pleasant part of the daily routine. Water supply is a separate challenge. There's no running water in most homes in Oymyakon. Water is delivered by truck, brought from the hot spring or from other sources. You buy your water, you store it. You heat it inside the house to keep it liquid. Everything involving water requires planning. Food is another distinct chapter of the Oymyakon story. Fresh vegetables are not something you casually obtain in Oymyakon in January. The growing season is short, maybe 3 months, at most. In summer, the long days and relatively warm temperatures allow for some local agriculture, but it's limited. The traditional diet of the region is heavy on meat and fat, which makes complete sense from a physiological standpoint. Your body burns more calories keeping warm, and fat is the densest caloric fuel available. The Sakha people developed a winter food culture built around fermented and frozen horse and beef meat, raw frozen fish, blood sausage, and dairy products. Particularly a fermented drink called kumis, made from mare's milk, the frozen raw fish dish called stroganina, shaved from a frozen fish and eaten immediately, sometimes with salt or mustard, is considered a delicacy and is deeply embedded in regional culture. You take a frozen fish out of the cold, you shave thin strips from it with a knife, and you eat them frozen or near frozen. The texture is unlike anything in the culinary traditions of warmer places. Frozen meat, when it's cold enough, can be shaved the same way. The meat doesn't spoil because nothing can spoil at -50. In a very real sense, the outdoors in winter is a freezer. People store food outside because there is no colder place available. You keep your fish in the snow. You hang your meat in a shed. The temperature is your refrigeration. This works beautifully, right up until the point where it stops working, which is summer. The transition between Yakutian winter and Yakutian summer is a logistical challenge of some complexity, as we'll discuss in due course. But for now, let's stay in the dark. The psychological dimension of Oymyakon's winter is something that researchers and residents have touched on, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. 8 months of cold, 2 months where the temperature rarely climbs above -30. The brief twilight days of January, the darkness. People who live in Oymyakon are not, by and large, complaining. This is a thing that visitors consistently note with some surprise. The people in Oymyakon are not dramatically unhappy about their circumstances. They are adapted. They have grown up with this. Their parents grew up with this. The cold is not a problem to be solved or an obstacle to be overcome. It is simply the condition of existence, and you structure your life accordingly. There's a pragmatism in that which is, in its own quiet way, kind of inspiring. The universe gave them -71 and a valley that traps cold air and 2 months of near total darkness. And they said, fine, we'll make tea. We'll keep the fire going. We'll build our horses a shelter, and we'll put on another layer, and we'll go to school when it's only -48. That attitude, that specific Yakutian pragmatism, runs through everything we're going to talk about tonight. Keep it in mind as we go. Let's now take a gentle detour to talk about the road that connects Oymyakon to the rest of the world, because the road is part of the story, and because the road has a history that is, in this sleepy context, about as dark as this program gets. The Kolyma Highway. The Kolyma Highway runs roughly 2,000 kilometers from Yakutsk to Magadan, the port city on the Sea of Okhotsk. It passes through some of the most remote terrain in Siberia, through the Kolyma region, which is a name that carries significant historical weight. In the 1930s, under Stalin, the Soviet state established a network of labor camps in the Kolyma region. These camps, part of the vast Gulag system, were designed to extract forced labor for mining, primarily gold and other minerals. The conditions in the Kolyma camps were among the worst in the entire Gulag system, which is saying something, because the Gulag system was generally not known for its hospitality. The Kolyma camps operated through winters, where temperatures regularly hit -50. Prisoners were forced to work outdoors, mining, building roads, clearing forest in those temperatures, with inadequate clothing, inadequate food, and inadequate shelter. The death rates in the Kolyma camps at various points in their history were staggering. Historians estimate that somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million people died in the Kolyma region during the Gulag era. Some estimates go higher. The Kolyma Highway, or at least significant stretches of it, was built using Gulag labor. The workers who died building it were sometimes buried in the embankments of the road itself. There's a reason that the Kolyma Highway has acquired the informal name, the Road of Bones. It is not metaphorical. This history sits underneath the modern Kolyma Highway, which is today a working road, partly paved, partly gravel, in many stretches extremely rough and narrow. That connects the remote settlements of the interior with the coast. In winter, stretches of it freeze solid and are passable only in the coldest months, when rivers and swamps freeze enough to support vehicles. In spring and fall, sections become impassable mud. The road is, by most accounts, a significant adventure even with a modern vehicle and adequate preparation. Tourists occasionally drive the Kolyma Highway, which requires a certain kind of temperament. The scenery is spectacular: vast taiga, mountains, river valleys, the enormous sky of northern Siberia. The road is challenging. The history is heavy. It is not a light road, emotionally or practically, but it connects Oymyakon to the wider world, and that connection matters. Let's pause here, take a breath of warm air, and make ourselves comfortable, because we've been in the cold for a while. Let's come back to the people, specifically. Let's come back to the indigenous peoples of Yakutia, and let's go back further than the Russians, back to before the Ostrogi and the fur trade and the exile routes, back to when the Sakha arrived in their new home and started figuring out how to survive. == the Sakha people. How to build a life in the impossible, the Sakha. Sometimes called Yakuts, a name that the Sakha themselves didn't use, but that Russian colonizers applied, and that has stuck in some contexts, are, as I mentioned earlier, a Turkic people who migrated into the Lena River basin several centuries before Russian contact. The details of their migration are reconstructed from linguistic evidence, oral tradition, and archaeology. And like most ancient migrations, the picture is somewhat fuzzy around the edges. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the Sakha came from the south. Their language is related to languages spoken in Central Asia. Their original culture was pastoral, built around horses and cattle, and somewhere between the 10th and 14th centuries, the scholars argue about the specifics. They moved north into the Lena River basin, pushed by pressure from other peoples, or pulled by the relative openness of the north. When they got there, they found themselves sharing territory with other indigenous peoples who had been in the region for much longer. The Evens, the Evenks, the Yukagir, these are people whose presence in the Siberian far north goes back thousands of years, who had long since adapted their lives to the extreme cold through a different set of strategies. The Evens and Evenks were primarily reindeer herders and hunters, following the herds across enormous territories. The Yukagir were hunters and fishermen, among the oldest known inhabitants of the region. The Sakha, arriving with their horses and cattle, occupied a slightly different ecological niche. They tended to settle near rivers, where they could find the grass and hay their animals needed. They spread primarily through the Lena River basin and its tributaries, adapting their techniques to each local environment. The relationship between the Sakha and the earlier inhabitants was complex. There was trade, intermarriage, sometimes conflict. The Sakha incorporated elements of Evenk and even culture, particularly in the areas of cold weather survival and reindeer herding, while maintaining their own distinct language and identity. Over time, the Sakha became the dominant indigenous culture of the Lena Basin, not by overwhelming the others militarily, but by sheer population growth and adaptability. Sakha traditional culture before Russian contact was organized around kinship groups, extended family networks that cooperated in herding, hunting, and mutual support. Leadership was through elders and through a class of wealthy herders who owned large numbers of horses and cattle. The horse in Sakha culture was more than a working animal. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and identity. The richest men were those with the most horses. The Yakutian horse was currency, dowry, sacrifice, and pride simultaneously. Religion in the traditional Sakha framework was a form of shamanism. The universe was populated with spirits, spirits of rivers, forests, animals, weather. Human beings existed within this spirit world and had to maintain careful relationships with it. The shamans, called Un for male shamans, Udegan for female, were intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world. They conducted ceremonies, diagnosed illness, mediated conflicts, communicated with the dead. They wore elaborate ceremonial costumes and worked themselves into trance states through drumming and chanting. The most important ceremonial event in the Sakha calendar was and remains the Oymyakon, the midsummer festival. Oymyakon is celebrated at the summer solstice, when the sun barely sets, and the land is at its brief, glorious maximum of warmth and light. It is a celebration of summer, of the sun, of the horse, of community. Kumis, the fermented mare's milk, flows freely. There is dancing, singing, competitive games. It is, in a beautiful and obvious way, the opposite of January. It is the counterweight to the darkness and cold. The Oymyakon survived Russian colonization, survived Soviet atheism, survived everything, and is today recognized as an important cultural event in the Sakha Republic. Thousands of people attend. It has been nominated for UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List. Some things are too deeply rooted to kill. The Sakha's adaptation to the cold went beyond clothing and housing, though those were crucial. It was a total cognitive and cultural framework. The cold was not an enemy. It was a condition with its own rules and its own logic. You learned those rules. You internalized them. You taught them to your children before they could fully understand why they needed to know them. Don't touch metal with bare hands. If you get wet, deal with it immediately. Never go anywhere without telling someone where you are going and when you expect to return. Know the signs of frostbite, the white patches, the loss of sensation, and act on them instantly. Learn to read the sky and the wind. Understand that the cold can change faster than you expect. Pay attention. These rules existed because they had been written in the worst possible way, in deaths, in losses, in the hard experience of generations. They were practical wisdom distilled from catastrophe. The Sakha also had a sophisticated understanding of the specific environment of Yakutia that went beyond cold survival. They understood the permafrost in the specific ways that mattered for their lives, where to find water in winter, where the ground was suitable for building, which soils were stable and which were not. They understood the rivers and the seasonal rhythms of flooding and freezing. They knew the hunting and fishing patterns, the animal behavior, the plant cycles. This is what indigenous ecological knowledge looks like in practice. It's not romantic, it's practical. It is a database of environmental information accumulated over generations, stored in culture and language and practice. And it is often more detailed and more accurate than anything that external researchers can compile in a few seasons of study. When Russian colonizers arrived in the 17th century, they had their maps and their administrative systems and their guns and their intentions. What they mostly did not have was any idea how to live in Yakutia. That knowledge belonged to the people who had been there. Over the following century or two, Russian settlers in Yakutia learned slowly, imperfectly, sometimes with the price of lives, from the Sakha and from the other indigenous peoples. They adopted elements of the clothing. They adopted aspects of the diet. They adopted the horses. The process of cultural exchange went both ways, unevenly and unequally, but in the direction of survival requiring that you pay attention to what the people around you know. The Russians also brought things that changed Yakutia. Grain crops, introduced into the southern parts of the Republic, where the climate was somewhat less brutal. New trade goods, iron tools, cloth, tea, tobacco, the Orthodox Church, literacy in Russian, administrative structures, and, as I mentioned, exiles. Let's talk about the exiles now, because they deserve attention, and because their stories are woven through the history of Yakutia in ways that still resonate. The Frozen Exiles. When Russia sent its problems, North Russia has a long and specific tradition of solving political problems by sending them somewhere very far away. The logic is not complicated. If someone is causing trouble in Moscow or St. Petersburg, or wherever the center of power happens to be, put them in a place where they can't cause trouble anymore. Somewhere distant, somewhere cold, somewhere from which they cannot easily return. Siberia in general, and Yakutia in particular, served this function for centuries. The earliest significant wave of political exiles to Yakutia came in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. People who had run afoul of Peter the Great's reforms, religious dissidents known as Old Believers, who refused to accept the church reforms of Patriarch Nikon, various nobles who had been on the wrong side of court politics. They arrived in Yakutsk and its surrounding villages and were told, essentially, to stay there. Some of them adapted. Some of them died. Some of them built small, peculiar, isolated communities that mixed their old culture with the new environment they found themselves in. The intellectual exiles of the 19th century are perhaps the most famous. The Decembrists, the liberal noblemen who attempted a coup against Tsar Nicholas I in December 1825, an uprising that was crushed with remarkable efficiency, were sent to Siberia in large numbers. Some went to the mines of Katorga. Some were sent to more isolated postings. Some ended up in Yakutia. The Decembrists were an unusual kind of exile. They were educated, many of them brilliant, committed to ideas of liberty and reform that had made them dangerous in St. Petersburg. In Siberia, stripped of their freedom of movement, many of them became teachers, doctors, amateur scientists. Some married local women and started families. Some made significant contributions to the understanding of Siberia, its geography, its peoples, its natural history, precisely because they were there and had time and minds that needed occupation. There's something poignant about the Decembrists in Siberia. These men had dreamed of transforming Russia, of moving it toward constitutional government and the abolition of serfdom. They failed catastrophically, and they were buried in ice and distance. And some of them sat in their Siberian exile and became naturalists, studying the permafrost and the plants and the indigenous peoples with the same careful attention they had once directed toward political theory. Because the mind needs something to do, even in exile. The revolutionary exiles of the late 19th and early 20th centuries followed a similar pattern. Vladimir Lenin spent time in Siberian exile, though not specifically in Yakutia. He was in the Krasnoyarsk region. Joseph Stalin was exiled to Siberia several times before the revolution, which tells you something about the system's imperfect ability to contain the people it was trying to neutralize. Many other Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, anarchists, and various other flavors of political trouble found themselves in Siberian exile during the Tsarist period. The practice continued, more intensely and more brutally, under the Soviet system. The Gulag, the network of labor camps that Stalin used to incarcerate and exploit perceived enemies of the state, sent enormous numbers of people to Yakutia and the surrounding regions. These were not genteel exiles with time to write memoirs. These were people working in mines and on roads and in forests in temperatures that were, as we have established, lethal without adequate protection. And adequate protection was often not provided. The Kolyma camps, which we mentioned earlier in the context of the highway, were the worst of the worst. Writers like Varlam Shalamov, who survived 17 years in the Kolyma camps, documented the experience in his Kolyma Tales, short stories that are among the most devastating pieces of literature produced in the 20th century. Shalamov's description of life in the camps, the cold, the hunger, the random cruelty, the slow diminishment of the human person under those conditions, is not something that makes for light reading. It is, in its own way, essential reading, but not at bedtime. What it tells us, among other things, is that Yakutia's cold was weaponized. The same cold that the Sakha had learned to live alongside over centuries was deployed as a tool of state violence against people who had done nothing, or nothing that any reasonable person would consider a crime. This is a thread that runs through the history of extreme environments generally. The places that are hardest to live in are often the places where states choose to dispose of the people they want to forget. Deserts, jungles, the far north. The environment does the state's work for it, or at least helps. The Gulag in Yakutia began to wind down after Stalin's death in 1953. The camps were gradually dismantled or converted to other uses. Prisoners were, in many cases, released, though their releases were complicated by restrictions on where they could go and what they could do. Many of the towns in the Kolyma region, Magadan, Suzuman, various smaller settlements, exist today in large part because of the Gulag, because the labor of prisoners built them, and the survivors and their descendants stayed. Yakutia emerged from the Stalinist era with a scarred history, and paradoxically, a significant boost to its population and infrastructure. The mining industry that the Gulag had established, gold, tin, coal, uranium, continued after the camps closed, operated by civilian workers who were often there for the wages, which were significantly higher in the far north to compensate for the conditions. The Soviet policy of northern coefficients, extra pay for working in harsh environments, drew workers to Yakutia who would not otherwise have gone. Infrastructure that the Gulag labor had built, rough and brutal, as it was laid the foundation for the later, more humane development of the region. Roads, mines, towns, the skeleton of a modern economy assembled from human suffering. This is not a comfortable history. It's not meant to be, but it's honest and honesty is the least we owe to the people whose lives were consumed by it. Let's pause here, breathe, and let that settle for a moment. Then, when you're ready, let's talk about the diamonds. Because Yakutia, as it turned out, was not just cold and remote and historically complicated. Yakutia was also, underneath all that permafrost, extraordinarily rich. And that richness, when it was discovered, changed everything. Diamonds, gold, and the Earth's buried treasure in 1954. A geologist named Larisa Popugiva was working in Yakutia as part of a Soviet geological survey. She was looking for diamonds. The Soviet Union had been looking for diamonds in Siberia for years because diamonds were both economically valuable and strategically important, not just for jewelry, but for industrial applications, for cutting tools, for precision manufacturing. The USSR needed its own domestic supply. It was getting somewhat tired of depending on foreign sources. Popugiva found what she was looking for. She identified a kimberlite pipe, the geological structure associated with diamond deposits in what is now the Mir Mine district of Yakutia. This discovery was, to put it mildly, significant. The pipe was enormous. The diamond content was high. The Soviet government, recognizing what it had found, immediately classified the discovery and began planning extraction on a massive scale. The result was the Mir Mine, Mir meaning world or peace in Russian, a characteristically Soviet name for a characteristically Soviet enterprise. The open pit mine at Mir Mine became, over the following decades, one of the largest diamond mines in the world. At its peak, it was one of the most productive diamond operations on the planet, and the pit itself, roughly half a kilometer deep and over a kilometer across, became one of the most recognizable industrial sites in Russia. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but widely repeated, that the helicopters flying over the Mir pit had to be careful about the updraft created by the massive depression, which could suck them in. The pit was, and remains, a genuinely extraordinary piece of geology transformed by human industry. Mir Mine became a city because of the mine. A city built on the diamond deposit in the Siberian permafrost, completely improbable and completely functional. Today, Mir Mine has a population of around 35,000 people. It has apartment blocks and schools, and a cultural center, and an ice palace. A building made of ice that houses various cultural events and attractions. Because if you live in Yakutia, you might as well lean into it. It has a diamond museum where you can see some of the extraordinary gems that have come out of the local mines over the decades. The Mir Mine's open pit phase was exhausted by 2001, and subsequent operations moved underground, where mining continues today in the form of the Mir Mine underground mine. The economics of diamond mining from this depth are challenging, but apparently viable, which tells you something about the value of what's in the ground. Mir Mine was not alone. As Soviet geological surveys continued through the 1950s and 1960s, more diamond deposits were found in Yakutia. The Republic turned out to be sitting on one of the world's great diamond fields. the Yakutian Diamond Province, part of the Siberian Craton, a geological formation of ancient, stable rock that has been accumulating diamonds in kimberlite pipes for hundreds of millions of years. The company that came to control all of this was ALROSA, a portmanteau of Almazy R. Asii S. Aka, meaning Diamonds of Russia Sakha. ALROSA is today one of the world's largest diamond producers, responsible for roughly a quarter to a third of global rough diamond production, depending on the year. It is a joint stock company whose shareholders include the Russian federal government, the Sakha Republic government, and private investors. Its operations span multiple mines across Yakutia, employing tens of thousands of people. The diamond industry fundamentally changed the economic profile of the Sakha Republic. Before diamonds, the region's economy was primarily based on reindeer herding, fur trapping, subsistence farming in the south, and whatever mining the Gulag had established. After diamonds, and after the discovery of significant gold deposits in the northeast, building on the Kolyma gold tradition, Yakutia became one of the wealthiest regions of Russia per capita, its fortunes tied to commodity prices and global demand for gems and metals. This is somewhat unusual. Yakutia is, in terms of living conditions and human geography, one of the most challenging places in Russia to inhabit. But in terms of raw resource wealth, it is extraordinary. The combination creates a particular economic and social dynamic. The workers who come to Yakutia for the mines often work on rotation schedules, spending several weeks in the field, then returning to warmer parts of Russia for rest periods. The permanent residents, the Sakha, and other indigenous peoples, the descendants of old settlers and exiles, the people who have made Yakutia their home, coexist with this rotating workforce of miners and engineers who are there for the money and plan to leave eventually. The diamond wealth has also funded development in Yakutsk and other centers. Airports, hospitals, schools, the infrastructure of a modern regional capital that happens to be built on permafrost in one of the coldest places on Earth. Yakutsk today is, in a visual sense, somewhat jarring. It is a city of 300,000 people with modern shopping malls and universities, and a light traffic problem in summer, where the buildings are all on stilts, and where the temperature in January makes outdoor activities a matter of brief necessity rather than extended pleasure. It has a vibrant cultural scene, theater, music, literature in the Sakha language. It has a university. It has an airport that operates year-round, connecting it to Moscow and other major Russian cities. It also has, in various parts of the city, the leaning, settling buildings that permafrost dynamics produce when buildings weren't put on proper piles, and entire neighborhoods that were built in the Soviet era with what turned out to be insufficient attention to ground conditions. The city is in a constant, slow negotiation with the ground underneath it, which is itself in a slow negotiation with a warming climate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's pull back from the cities and the diamonds and spend a little more time with the people who have been there longest the specific textures of how they live. The horse culture, the reindeer herders, and the art of staying warm of all the remarkable things about Yakutia's indigenous cultures. The relationship with horses is perhaps the most unexpected if you're coming to it fresh. The standard image of the far north, the Arctic and subarctic, is reindeer. Reindeer are the iconic northern animal, the ones with the sleds and the evolutionary cold adaptations, the ones central to the Sami culture of Scandinavia and the Evink and even cultures of Siberia. Reindeer make sense in the far north. They're designed for it. Horses are not. Or rather, most horses are not. The Yakutian horse is a specific argument against that generalization. The Yakutian horse is small, compact, barrel-chested. It has extremely short legs relative to its body, which reduces the surface area exposed to cold. Its winter coat is remarkable, dense, long, shaggy, unlike the sleek coats of most horse breeds. The mane and tail are full and thick. The coat of a Yakutian horse in winter is estimated to be 3 to 4 times thicker than the coat of a comparable temperate horse breed. But the physiology goes deeper than the coat. Yakutian horses have higher concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids in their blood, which keeps the blood from becoming too viscous in cold temperatures. Their lower legs have a countercurrent heat exchange system. Warm blood flowing down from the body heats cold blood flowing up from the extremities, keeping the legs functional without losing too much core body heat. Their hooves are hardened for cutting through ice and compacted snow to reach buried grass. They can survive outdoors year-round in Yakutia. In winter, they dig through snow with those hardened hooves to reach the dry grass underneath, a behavior called cratering or pawing. They stand in groups, huddling for warmth, and they do not freeze. Genomic studies published in the 2010s identified the specific genetic adaptations that distinguish Yakutian horses from their relatives. The adaptations appear to have developed relatively quickly. Within the few centuries since the Sakha brought their horses north, which is a striking example of rapid domesticated animal evolution under selection pressure. The cold killed horses that couldn't cope, and the horses that had slightly better cold adaptations survived and reproduced. Repeat for a few hundred generations, and you have the Yakutian horse. The Sakha use horses primarily for meat and milk rather than as riding animals, though they ride them too. Horse meat is a central part of the traditional Sakha diet. Fatty, rich, calorie-dense, and well suited to the needs of a body that spends a lot of energy staying warm. Sakha's ceremonial relationship with horses goes back to their origins as a pastoral steppe people, and it has survived their migration north and their conversion to Orthodox Christianity and their absorption into the Russian state and Soviet collectivization and all the other disruptions of the last 4 centuries. The Oymyakon festival, the midsummer celebration, remains centered on horses. The ceremonial pole, the surge, to which horses are traditionally tethered. The kumis drunk from the wooden cup, the horse-themed imagery in Sakha art and design. The horse is the animal of the Sakha people in in a way that goes beyond the merely practical. Alongside the horse culture, and often in the same territories, but belonging to different peoples, is the reindeer herding culture. The Evens, Evenks, and Yukagir are the primary reindeer herding peoples of Yakutia. Their relationship to the land is fundamentally different from the Sakhas, where the Sakha tend to be more sedentary, keeping horses and cattle, living in substantial winter houses near rivers. The reindeer herding peoples are, or traditionally were, fully nomadic. They followed their herds across enormous territories, thousands of kilometers in the course of a year's movement, living in portable dwellings and carrying everything they needed with them. The Evenk traditional dwelling is called a chum, a conical structure covered with reindeer skins, built on a frame of poles that can be assembled and disassembled in less than an hour. The chum is well suited to nomadic life, light, portable, efficient. Inside, a central fire provides heat and cooking. The reindeer skins that cover it are extraordinary insulators. The chum can maintain a reasonable interior temperature even in severe cold, provided you keep the fire going. Reindeer provide almost everything a nomadic people in the far north need. Meat high in fat and protein, calorie dense. Hides for clothing and dwellings. Bone and antler for tools. Tendons for thread and bindings. Milk less voluminous than cow milk, but nutritionally dense. And transportation. Reindeer can be trained to carry loads and to pull sleds. And a good reindeer sled is an extraordinarily efficient way to move across the winter landscape. The herding lifestyle requires constant attention and intimate knowledge of the landscape. You know where the grazing is in each season. You know the migration routes. You know the predators and how to deter them. You know the signs of bad weather. You know how to read snow conditions, which snow is safe to travel on, which might give way, where there might be hidden water. Soviet collectivization in the 1930s disrupted the reindeer herding cultures profoundly. The nomadic peoples were forced into collective enterprises, kolkhozy, and required to settle in fixed locations. Their reindeer were collectivized. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools to receive Soviet education. The full nomadic lifestyle, which had sustained these cultures for thousands of years, was declared backward and incompatible with socialist modernization. The results were, predictably, damaging. Cultures built around movement and animal husbandry don't translate easily into the sedentary collective model. Reindeer herds that had been managed by people who knew them intimately were put under collective management by people who didn't. Populations that had been healthy and self-sufficient became dependent on state supply chains that were erratic and often inadequate. Languages began to erode as children were educated in Russian. The Soviet period also brought infrastructure healthcare, however rudimentary, that dramatically reduced mortality from diseases that had devastated indigenous populations after Russian contact. Schools, roads, these were real benefits delivered alongside real harms in the complicated package that modernization so often is. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, Sakha Republic declared significant autonomy and began a process of cultural and linguistic revival. The Sakha language was given official status alongside Russian. Indigenous cultural institutions were supported. Some degree of land rights was recognized for indigenous herding communities. The revival has been partial and complicated. The Sakha language is in better shape than many indigenous languages in Russia. It has speakers, schools, media, a literary tradition. The other indigenous languages are in more precarious states. The traditional nomadic lifestyle is maintained by some communities, but at reduced scale and often in modified form. Young people face the same pressures that young people in remote communities face everywhere. The pull of cities, of connectivity, of economic opportunity that is geographically concentrated away from the homeland. The reindeer herders who continue their work today do so with some modern tools, snowmobiles alongside sleds, satellite phones, GPS. But the fundamental relationship with the landscape and the animals remains. And the knowledge that it takes to manage a reindeer herd across 1,000 kilometers of taiga is not something you can download or look up. It lives in the people who carry it, passed from generation to generation. And when that chain breaks, it is very hard to repair. There is a man, I'll call him simply a herder, from the Even community in northeastern Yakutia, because the specific details of individual lives are not mine to distribute without permission. Who was interviewed by a researcher studying traditional ecological knowledge. He described knowing the specific behavior of every animal in his herd individually, not just their general disposition, but their particular habits, their relationships with each other, their responses to different weather conditions. A herd of several hundred animals, and he knew each one. That is what it means to carry this kind of knowledge. That is what is at stake when we talk about cultural survival in Yakutia. Let's float a little now toward the seasons, because Yakutia's story is not only a winter story. The summer comes, and when it does, it is a story of its own. The summer paradox. When Yakutia gets warm, people who know Yakutia only for its winters are sometimes genuinely surprised to learn about the summers, because Yakutia's summers are not gentle. They are not a mild, pleasant interlude between cold seasons. They are a completely different kind of extreme. July in Yakutsk sees average temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius, about 68 Fahrenheit. This is warm, pleasantly warm by most standards. But the temperature swings don't stop there. Yakutsk has recorded summer highs above 38 degrees Celsius, over 100 Fahrenheit. The temperatures swing between the winter minimum and the summer maximum in Yakutia is among the largest of any inhabited place on Earth, potentially 100 degrees or more in a single year. You go from -50 to +38. Your infrastructure, your clothing, your psychology, your entire way of organizing life has to accommodate that range. The summers are long in terms of daylight. In June, the sun barely sets. The sky stays light until midnight, or essentially doesn't get dark at all at higher latitudes. After the darkness of winter, the perpetual summer light is disorienting in its own way, a different kind of extreme. The body's circadian rhythms struggle with both. The summer also brings the mosquitoes. Yakutia in July is famous for its mosquitoes. Not merely inconvenient mosquitoes, not merely more than usual mosquitoes, the kind of mosquitoes that researchers who study them describe with a kind of exhausted respect. The wetlands and boggy ground of the Siberian taiga, thawed in summer, provide ideal breeding conditions for several species of mosquito, and they breed in prodigious numbers. Locals cover up. They wear face nets. They keep fires going. They smear themselves with repellent. Horses stand in the smoke from fires specifically to keep the mosquitoes off. The reindeer move toward higher, windier ground in summer to escape the insects. The mosquitoes are a summer ordeal that is not physically dangerous to most adults, but that is genuinely oppressive and constant. The permafrost creates complications in summer that mirror, in opposite ways, the complications of winter. The active layer, the top meter or so of ground that thaws each summer, becomes soft, muddy, and unstable. Roads that were frozen solid in winter become difficult or impassable as the surface layer turns to mud. The ground heaves and subsides. Buildings settle in ways they don't in winter. The whole landscape is temporarily softened. This is the season when the thermokarst formations develop, the ponds and bogs that form when permafrost ground ice melts, causing the surface to collapse into depressions. Yakutia has an extraordinary landscape of thermokarst terrain in many areas, with the characteristic, alas, depressions, oval basins that form when permafrost melts under a lake, or where ice-rich ground has subsided. These are beautiful from the air, a landscape of oval green and blue patches studding the taiga, and they are also a sign of a land in slow, ongoing thermal transformation. The summer is when the outdoor work happens. Hay is cut and stored for the cattle and horses who will spend the winter indoors, or who will need supplemental feeding. Vegetables are planted and frantically grown in the short growing season. Fish are caught and preserved, smoked, dried, frozen for winter storage. Berries are gathered. The forest is briefly hospitable. Yakutian summer cuisine is a different experience from winter cuisine. Fresh berries, cloudberries, lingonberries, crowberries are abundant and eaten directly or preserved. Wild mushrooms come up in extraordinary profusion after rain. Fish are smoked over open fires. There is a brief, glorious season of fresh food before the cold closes in again. And then, by September, the cold begins to return. The nights get cold, the mornings frost. By October, the ground is freezing again. By November, the world is white, and the whole cycle starts over. There is, in this extreme seasonality, a rhythm that shapes the psychology of people in Yakutia. The world is not static. It doesn't maintain a comfortable middle temperature year-round. It swings between extremes, and you move with it. You live differently in winter and summer. Your food is different. Your schedule is different. Your relationship to the outdoors is different. Your clothes are different. Even your mood, perhaps. researchers who study well-being in extreme environments have noted that communities in very high latitudes often show remarkable resilience in this context, not because the extremes are pleasant, but because they are predictable. You know the winter is coming. You prepare for it. You know the summer will come again. You hold on. The pattern provides its own kind of stability. This is not to say that life in Yakutia is free of the mental health challenges that come with darkness, cold, and isolation. Depression, alcohol abuse, and the social problems that come with them are present. These are not things to minimize or romanticize away, but there is also, genuinely, a culture that has found ways to celebrate the cycles. The spring holidays, when the first thaw comes. The summer Oymyakon. The ways communities mark the progress of the year together. Because in a place where the year is genuinely extreme, marking its passages matters. Let's go back to Oymyakon for a moment and talk specifically about the school, the children, and what a childhood in the coldest inhabited place on Earth actually looks like. Growing up in Oymyakon. Cold as ordinary life. There's a photograph that circulates online from time to time. A group of school children in Oymyakon, bundled in enormous fur coats and hats, standing outside in what is clearly severe cold, smiling. Some of them are holding up a thermometer that reads somewhere around -50. They look, in the photograph, like they are having a perfectly fine time. This is the thing that surprises people most about Oymyakon. The children are okay. The children are, by most accounts, quite normal children who happen to live in a remarkably cold place. They go to school. They play. They have friends and rivalries and favorite subjects. They watch videos on their phones. They are connected, increasingly, to the wider world through the internet, which reached even Oymyakon. The school in Oymyakon takes the cold seriously as an institutional matter. The temperature is monitored. At -52, as we established, school is canceled, not because -52 is considered particularly alarming, but because it's the agreed upon threshold below, which walking to school tips from adventurous to genuinely risky. Below -40, teachers often call children's homes to make sure they have been adequately dressed before leaving. There is a system because there has to be. Children in Oymyakon learn about cold the way children in coastal areas learn about water safety. You don't go out without telling someone. You dress properly. You know the signs of frostbite, and you know what to do if you see them. You know that if your car breaks down on a road in winter, you stay with the car, you don't walk, because walking through -50 in the dark, far from shelter, is how people die. These are the rules of the place, and children learn them young. What does play look like in Oymyakon in January? It looks brief. Outdoor play in serious cold is limited, not because the children are forbidden to go outside, but because being outside at -50 is not an activity you sustain for long. The traditional games of the Sakha and the other peoples of the region are often indoor games, games of skill and storytelling and music and craft. The long winter evenings are for being together inside. There's a tradition of oral literature storytelling that is particularly strong in Yakutia. The Alonko is the Sakha heroic epic, a vast cycle of oral poems that tell the stories of heroes battling supernatural adversaries across a richly imagined mythological universe. A skilled Alonkasat, an Alonko performer, could perform for days without repeating themselves. The epic was maintained in oral tradition for centuries, was transcribed and studied beginning in the 19th century, and is now recognized as one of the UNESCO masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Children in Yakutia grow up with this. They grow up with stories that are rooted in the specific landscape they inhabit, stories about spirits of rivers and forests, heroes who journey through extreme cold, magical animals with meaning. The Alonko is, among other things, a document of the environment as the Sakha experienced it over centuries. It is shaped by cold and darkness and the particular quality of the Yakutian landscape. The practical education of children in Oymyakon includes things that no school curriculum in temperate climates would need to address. How to care for horses in winter, the basics of reading weather signs, how to start and maintain a fire properly, the principles of building and maintaining a warm shelter, first aid for cold injuries. This isn't formal curriculum necessarily. Much of it is learned from family, from community, from the accumulated practice of daily life. But it is systematically transmitted because the environment demands it. Childhood in Oymyakon also includes the distinctive experience of Yakutian winter itself, the peculiar beauty of it. The way hoarfrost coats every surface in intricate crystals on cold mornings, the aurora borealis in clear winter nights, the blue light of the brief January noon, the sound of snow that is too cold to squeak when you step on it, just presses silently, the complete stillness of extreme cold, when the air is so cold it barely moves. People who grew up in Oymyakon and later moved away, and some do, drawn by opportunities in Yakutsk or other cities, describe missing the extremeness of it, missing the clarity of the cold, the specific sensory texture of a place that is uncompromisingly itself. There are no half measures in Oymyakon. It is what it is, completely, without apology. There's something, in a philosophical sense, rather admirable about a place that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Now, let's turn the page a little. We've been in Oymyakon, in the deep cold, in the indigenous cultures. Let's come at Yakutia from a different angle and talk about what happens when scientists, explorers, and the odd, ambitious journalist decide to go there and learn about it. Because the story of how Yakutia's extremity became known to the outside world is itself an interesting story. Explorers, scientists, and visitors. The outsiders view the systematic scientific study of Yakutia began, broadly speaking, with the expeditions that the Russian Academy of Sciences organized in the 18th century, the great survey expeditions that set out to understand the vast new territories that Russia was absorbing in Siberia and the Far East. The most significant of these was the Second Kamchatka Expedition, also called the Great Northern Expedition, which ran from 1733 to 1743. One of the largest scientific expeditions in history, involving hundreds of people and covering an enormous sweep of Siberian territory. One of the expedition's researchers, Johann Georg Gmelin, spent years traveling through Siberia and compiled the first systematic descriptions of the region's natural history, including its extreme climate. He reported temperatures that European scientists found nearly impossible to credit. Surely nothing could be that cold. It was that cold. The German naturalist and explorer Peter Simon Pallas traveled extensively in Siberia in the 1770s and documented the cold more rigorously. He brought back specimens, observations, and accounts of permafrost and extreme temperatures that contributed to the European scientific understanding of Siberia's climate. But it was in the 19th century that the systematic meteorological study of Yakutia's cold really got going. The Russian Geographical Society, founded in 1845, made the scientific survey of Russia and its territories a priority. And Yakutia was high on the list of places that needed systematic study. The verification of Verkhansk as the pole of cold was partly the result of a remarkable individual, the political exile Ivan Chersky. Chersky was a Polish geologist who had participated in the 1863 Polish uprising against Russian rule and had been exiled to Siberia as a result. He ended up in Yakutia, and in the manner of the intellectually engaged exiles we discussed earlier, he turned his exile into scientific work. He conducted extensive geological and geographical surveys of the region, including the Lena River Basin. He contributed substantially to the understanding of Yakutia's physical geography. Chersky's work, and that of other observers stationed in Yakutia in the second half of the 19th century, built up the dataset that established Verkhansk and Oymyakon as record holders for extreme cold. The 20th century brought more systematic study, including the Soviet-era atmospheric and permafrost research programs that made Yakutia one of the best-studied cold environments in the world from a purely scientific standpoint. The permafrost research in particular was driven by practical necessity. You can't build Soviet industrial infrastructure on ground you don't understand, and permafrost had a way of making its presence known in dramatic ways when it was ignored. The Soviet Permafrost Research Institute in Yakutsk, the Melnikov Permafrost Institute, named after the Soviet scientist Pavel Melnikov, became and remains one of the world's leading centers for permafrost science. Its researchers maintain long-term monitoring networks across Yakutia and have contributed fundamental understanding of permafrost dynamics. This work has become increasingly important as climate change has altered the thermal regime of the permafrost, and the Melnikov Institute's long historical datasets provide crucial baseline data for understanding those changes. On the other side of the scientific spectrum, the more human interest side, Yakutia has attracted a steady stream of journalists, documentary filmmakers, and adventurous travelers over the decades who have come to see the cold for themselves and to tell the story to outside audiences. The British journalist Amos Chappell spent time in Oymyakon in 2013 and produced a photo essay that went viral and introduced many Western audiences to the settlement for the first time. His photographs showed the mundane reality of extreme cold life. People with ice-crusted eyelashes, frozen laundry on clotheslines, cattle exhaling steam in an indoor shed, children on their way to school. The photographs had a documentary quality that made the place real in a way that statistics alone can't manage. Various television documentaries have ventured to Oymyakon over the years, and they tend to follow a somewhat predictable narrative arc. Outsider arrives, is shocked by the cold, attempts some local activity, driving a car, eating stroganoff, using an outhouse, marvels at the toughness of the locals, goes home with a new appreciation for central heating. The locals, for their part, are invariably polite and patient with the cameras. Though one imagines they find the whole, "Isn't it cold here?" conversation somewhat repetitive after the 40th documentary crew. There's a tourist trade now, which is genuinely remarkable. A small but real tourist trade based on the settlement's reputation as the coldest inhabited place on Earth. People pay to go there in the depths of winter, to experience -50, to visit the monument, to eat stroganoff, to say they did it. There's a small guest house. The local administration has leaned into the branding. Oymyakon officially calls itself the Pole of Cold and has developed some modest infrastructure around that identity. This is, depending on your perspective, either a clever community response to a global niche opportunity, or a slightly absurd spectacle of people paying to go somewhere that most people couldn't be paid to visit. Possibly both. The scientific tourists are a slightly different category, researchers who come to study the permafrost, the cold-adapted biology, the indigenous cultures, the climate signals in the frozen ground. These visitors tend to stay longer and produce work that lasts longer, and their presence in Yakutia has contributed to both the scientific understanding of the region and, occasionally, to the advocacy for preserving its indigenous cultures and environments. Let's settle in again now, and let's move toward the part of this story that is perhaps the most pressing, the most immediate, and the most uncertain. What is happening to Yakutia now as the climate changes and the permafrost thaws, and the world that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years begins, slowly and unevenly, to soften. The warming world, and the thawing ground the permafrost is thawing. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not uniformly, but across Yakutia, across Siberia, across the Arctic and subarctic regions of the world. The permafrost that has been frozen for thousands, and in some places millions of years, is warming. And in some areas, and at some depths, it is thawing. The numbers are unambiguous, even if their full implications are still being worked out. Average annual temperatures in Yakutia have risen by roughly 2 to 3 degrees Celsius over the past several decades, which sounds modest until you consider that for permafrost, a few degrees of warming makes the difference between frozen ground and thawing ground. The active layer, the top portion that thaws each summer, has been deepening. The permafrost table, the boundary between thawed and frozen ground, has been moving downward in many locations. New thermokarst features are forming. Old ones are expanding. In Yakutsk, the practical effects of permafrost thaw have been making themselves known in increasingly visible ways. Buildings built in the Soviet era, some of which were already struggling with inadequate foundations, are showing accelerating signs of subsidence. Roads buckle more than they used to. Infrastructure that was designed for a specific thermal regime is being subjected to a different one. There's a phenomenon that researchers have been tracking in Yakutia called drunken forests. Stands of trees that have tilted and leaned at odd angles because the permafrost beneath them has thawed and the previously frozen ground has become unstable. The trees, rooted in what was once solid frozen ground, now sit in ground that is no longer providing the rigid support it once did. They lean, they fall. The forest looks, from a certain angle, like it's been very slowly partying. The thermokarst formations are expanding. New lakes are forming where there were no lakes before, as ground ice melts and the surface collapses into the resulting void. Some thermokarst lakes grow quickly. Researchers have documented lakes appearing and growing significantly within years or decades, which is rapid by geological standards. The landscape is being redistributed. In the Badagay region of northeastern Yakutia, there is something called the Badagay crater. Officially, the Badagay megaslump, which is the largest known permafrost thaw slump in the world. It started as a small disturbance in the 1960s, likely accelerated by local deforestation that removed the insulating tree cover, and has been growing ever since. By the early 2020s, it was roughly a kilometer long and up to 100 meters deep, a gaping scar in the landscape where the permafrost has thawed and the ground has collapsed and eroded away. Scientists call it the gateway to the underworld, which is exactly the kind of name a scientist will give something when the technical description isn't dramatic enough. The Badagay crater is scientifically valuable precisely because it is exposing ancient frozen layers. As the crater walls erode, they reveal sediments and organic materials that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years. Ancient plant material, animal remains, the stratigraphic record of past climate eras. Scientists have collected specimens from the crater walls that date back 200,000 years or more. It is, in effect, a climate archive being involuntarily excavated by the warming world. The methane problem deserves more attention than we can fully give it tonight, but let's touch on it. Siberian permafrost, including Yakutia's, contains an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon, roughly twice the amount currently in the atmosphere. This carbon accumulated over millennia as plant material was frozen before it could fully decompose. As the permafrost thaws, that material decomposes and releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is, pound for pound, a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over short time periods. The methane released by thawing permafrost contributes to warming, which causes more permafrost to thaw, which releases more methane. This feedback loop is one of the things that climate scientists worry about when they talk about tipping points, threshold effects that once triggered are self-reinforcing and difficult to reverse. Across the Siberian tundra and wetlands, bubbling methane has been observed coming up through thaw lakes. In some areas, researchers can light the gas as it bubbles up through holes in ice, a visual that is both striking and somewhat disconcerting. The ground is releasing what was stored in it, and we are all, in a slow and abstract sense, downstream of that release. For the people of Yakutia, climate change is not an abstraction. It is their road buckling. It is their house settling. It is the river breakup happening earlier than their grandparents knew. It is the behavior of reindeer herds changing. It is the mosquito season starting earlier. It is the brief, unsettling experience of temperatures that feel wrong, not cold enough, not in the right way, at the wrong time of year. There is a concept in environmental science called solastalgia, the distress caused by changes to one's home environment. It was coined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht to describe the feeling of people who remain in a place while that place changes around them, who see the landscape they love becoming different in ways they didn't choose and can't stop. Solastalgia is a different thing from the homesickness of people who leave. It is the grief of people who stay while home leaves them. People of Yakutia, who have lived in this specific extreme landscape for generations, who have built their culture and their identity around it, are experiencing solastalgia. The cold is changing, not dramatically, not quickly by human experiential standards, but measurably, and in ways that have real consequences. This doesn't mean Yakutia will become warm. The winters will still be brutal for the foreseeable future. Oymyakon will still be cold enough to be Oymyakon, but the margins are shifting. The permafrost is shifting. The baseline is moving. And when your entire civilization was built on a specific baseline, the movement of that baseline matters. The Sakha Republic's government has been grappling with this, with varying degrees of effectiveness. There are infrastructure programs to address the building damage from permafrost thaw. There are scientific monitoring programs in partnership with the Melnikov Institute. There are conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, about economic development versus environmental protection, about diamond mining and its impacts, about what the region's future looks like if the resource economy continues and the permafrost continues to thaw. These are not easy conversations. They don't have easy answers. They are the conversations that communities in extreme environments are having around the world in various forms as the climate that shaped their world shifts. But let's not end there, or rather, let's not stay there for the rest of the night. Let's move to something a little warmer in the metaphorical sense. Let's talk about food in real detail, because Yakutian cuisine is one of the most interesting and least known food cultures in the world, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Eating at the end of the world. Yakutia and food culture. Food in Yakutia is, first and foremost, a survival technology. That may sound reductive, but it's actually the most respectful framing you can give it, because it means the food culture was developed by people who understood exactly what their bodies needed to live in the conditions they lived in, and they built their cuisine around that understanding. The fundamental nutritional reality of life in extreme cold is this: your body burns more calories maintaining your core temperature. The colder it is, the more energy you expend just by existing. In the depths of a Yakutian winter, a person's caloric needs are significantly higher than they would be in a temperate climate, and the food available has to meet those needs. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient. A gram of fat contains 9 calories. A gram of protein or carbohydrate contains 4. In a cold-adapted diet, you want fat. The traditional Sakha diet delivers fat generously. Horse meat is central to Sakha cuisine, and Yakutian horse meat is particularly fatty. The Yakutian horse, which stores enormous subcutaneous and intramuscular fat reserves for the winter, provides meat that is much fattier than the meat of typical temperate climate horse breeds. The fat of the Yakutian horse is high in polyunsaturated fatty acids and has a lower freezing point than other animal fats, which means it stays softer and more palatable even at cold temperatures. In a culture where food is often eaten cold or frozen, this matters. The most iconic Yakutian preparation of horse meat is probably the frozen slab. In winter, horses that have been slaughtered are allowed to freeze solid, and the frozen carcass is then cut or shaved as needed. The meat is sometimes eaten completely raw and frozen, shaved into thin slices like a cold carpaccio, or it's thawed and cooked. The freezing, in a climate where nothing spoils at -50, is the most reliable preservation method available. Stроганина, the frozen raw fish preparation, is perhaps the dish most associated with Yakutia in the outside world. To make stроганина, you take a completely frozen fish, typically a Siberian fish, Enya Elyeri Ma, chur, inkanu, or whitefish, and you shave thin curling slices from it with a knife while it's still frozen. You eat the shavings immediately while they're still cold and firm, often with salt or a mustard-based sauce. The texture is unlike anything in temperate climate culinary tradition. The fish is not raw in the sense of sushi. It hasn't been cured or prepared. It is simply frozen. The slices have a delicacy, a slight resistance, and a clean, fresh flavor that is, by all accounts of people who have tried it, surprisingly gentle and pleasant. The fish doesn't taste fishy the way cooked fish can. The cold suppresses some of the aromatic compounds that give cooked fish its strong smell. Locals in Yakutia are protective of stроганина. They have opinions about which fish makes the best stроганина, about the proper thickness of the shavings, about what to eat it with, and what to drink alongside it. It is a dish of craft and preference, not just survival necessity. It has the cultural depth of a beloved traditional food, which is exactly what it is. The dairy tradition in Yakutia is notable, given the climate. The Sakha kept cattle, Yakutian cattle, cold adapted like the horses, and developed a substantial dairy culture. The flagship product is a dish called salamat, a porridge made from sour cream or butter, with flour, rich and fatty, and calorie dense in the way that a Yakutian winter requires. It's also used ceremonially. Salamat is offered to guests, to elders, at celebrations. Bayastir is another traditional product, a fermented drink made from the buttermilk left after churning butter. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, is the most ceremonially significant dairy product, the one associated with the Usiak festival and with hospitality and celebration. It is mildly alcoholic, slightly fizzy, with a tart, clean flavor. Visitors to Yakutia who try it report a range of reactions, from surprisingly refreshing to not quite what I was expecting, which covers most of the possible ground. Wild plant foods contribute to the summer diet: the berries, the mushrooms, the various herbs and greens of the taiga. Some of these are preserved for winter use. Berries are frozen conveniently. The ambient temperature does the work, or made into preserves. Pine nuts, where available, are collected. Various roots and tubers are dug in the brief summer. The modern food situation in Yakutia is a complicated blend of traditional foods and imported goods. Yakutsk and other larger settlements have grocery stores that carry the full range of standard Russian and international products, vegetables, and fruit flown in from warmer parts of the country, packaged foods, imported goods. The supply chain is expensive. Transporting food to a place this remote costs money. But the range of available food in the city is broader than it once was. In rural communities and remote settlements like Oymyakon, the dependence on local food production and hunting and fishing is greater. The combination of traditional food skills and modern supply chains creates a food culture that is simultaneously ancient and contemporary, with home-preserved fish and store-bought instant noodles occupying the same pantry shelf. The nutritional science of the traditional Yakutian diet turns out to be quite sound when evaluated against modern understanding. High protein from meat and fish, high healthy fats from the specific animal breeds and from fish, vitamins from fermented dairy products, fish, and organ meats. The indigenous diet was not, as outside observers sometimes assumed, nutritionally limited. It was highly adapted to its context. The exception, historically, was vitamin C. Fresh vegetables are the primary dietary source of vitamin C in most cultures, and fresh vegetables are hard to come by in a Yakutian winter. The traditional response to this was the consumption of raw and lightly processed animal products, particularly organ meats and blood, which contain meaningful amounts of vitamin C when not cooked, since cooking destroys most of it. Raw frozen liver, adrenal glands, and blood were regular components of the traditional winter diet, providing the vitamin C otherwise have been absent. Scurvy, the classic vitamin C deficiency disease, was documented among Russian settlers in Yakutia who maintained European dietary practices and refused the organ meats that the indigenous diet offered. The indigenous peoples, eating as they had always eaten, generally did not suffer from it. Another lesson in the wisdom of local knowledge. Let's drift now to language, because Yakutia's languages are a story in themselves. The languages of the cold. Words for a world of ice. How many words for snow does the Sakha language have? This is a variation on the question that everyone asks about Arctic and subarctic languages. And specifically, it's a variation on the famous Eskimo words for snow question that circulates in popular culture. The answer, in most cases, is more complicated and more interesting than the question suggests. The Sakha language does have an extensive vocabulary for winter phenomena, not because Sakha speakers are specially poetic about the cold, but because the cold has so many distinct and practically important manifestations that a single word won't do. The type of snow matters. The condition of ice matters. The quality of cold matters. You need vocabulary to describe these things precisely, because the distinctions between them have consequences for survival. The Sakha language distinguishes between different types of ice on water: ice that is safe to walk on, ice that is deceptively thin, ice at various stages of freezing and thawing. It distinguishes between different snow conditions: powdery dry snow, wet snow, wind-packed snow, the crust that forms on snow after a thaw-refreeze cycle. The even and evenk languages have similarly specialized vocabularies for the conditions that matter most to their specific economic activities. The reindeer herders have words for snow conditions that affect grazing access, for ice conditions on rivers that affect travel, for wind patterns that affect comfort and danger. This is not supernatural. Languages develop specialized vocabularies for the domains that matter most in the lives of their speakers. English has a rich vocabulary for technology, law, and finance, because those are domains where English speakers have needed precision. The languages of Yakutia have rich vocabularies for cold, because that is where precision has mattered most. The Sakha language, Sakha, or sometimes referred to in Russian as Yakut, belongs to the Siberian branch of the Turkic language family. It is related to Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and ultimately to Turkish, though the relationship is distant enough that a contemporary Turkish speaker and a Sakha speaker cannot understand each other. Sakha has borrowed extensively from evenk, Russian, and other neighboring languages, reflecting the history of contact and exchange in the region. The language has a writing system, a Latin-based alphabet that was standardized in the 1930s, replaced with Cyrillic in the Stalinist era, and modified back toward its current Cyrillic-based form after the Soviet collapse. The Soviet effort to impose Cyrillic on the languages of Soviet peoples was part of a broader project of cultural Russification, and the post-Soviet period has seen various degrees of pushback against that legacy across the former Soviet republics. The Sakha language is in relatively good health compared to many indigenous languages. It has perhaps 250,000 speakers, though estimates vary. It is used in schools, in media, in literature, in official documents of the Sakha Republic. The Sakha Republic Constitution recognizes both Sakha and Russian as official languages. There is a Sakha language newspaper, Sakha Sire. There is Sakha language television and radio. There is a tradition of Sakha language literature that goes back to the 19th century, when scholars and writers first began to transcribe and develop written forms of the language. The literary tradition is anchored by the Alonko, the heroic epic, but extends into poetry, novels, and drama. The best known figure in Sakha literature is probably Alexei Kulikovsky, a poet who wrote in the late 19th and early 20th century, and whose work is considered foundational to the modern Sakha literary tradition. Kulikovsky engaged with the questions of cultural survival and adaptation that the Sakha people were facing as Russian influence intensified, and his poetry reflects a nuanced engagement with both indigenous tradition and the challenges of modernity. The other indigenous languages of Yakutia are in harder shape. The Even language has several thousand speakers, many of them elderly. The Evenk language is in a similar situation. The Yukagir language, which is a language isolate, not related to any other known language family, has fewer than 200 fluent speakers as of recent estimates. Languages with that few speakers are in serious danger of extinction within a generation or two. Language death is not just the loss of a communication system. It is the loss of a knowledge base. A language encodes the accumulated understanding of a community, the ecological knowledge, the relational vocabulary, the cultural categories that shape how its speakers perceive and interact with the world. When a language dies, that encoded knowledge is hard to transfer to any other language because the categories don't always translate. The efforts to document and revitalize the endangered languages of Yakutia, ongoing work by linguists at the Institute for Humanitarian Research and Indigenous Studies of the North in Yakutsk, and by various international collaborators, are working against the clock in some cases. The elders who carry the fullest knowledge of these languages are aging. The recordings and transcriptions and dictionaries that researchers are producing are important, but they are a preservation of a body of knowledge, not necessarily a continuation of a living tradition. The language situation in Yakutia reflects, in miniature, the larger situation of linguistic diversity across the world, where several thousand of the world's roughly 7,000 languages are considered endangered or critically endangered. The causes are the same everywhere. Economic pressure toward dominant languages, disrupted intergenerational transmission, urbanization, formal education conducted in dominant language schools. There are efforts to reverse these trends. Some Yakutian communities have established language nests For young children, immersive programs where toddlers spend their days with fluent elderly speakers, absorbing the language before formal schooling begins. Some families make deliberate choices to speak the indigenous language at home. These efforts don't always succeed in revitalizing a language, but they sometimes do. And the stories of language revival, Hawaiian, Welsh, Hebrew in its modern form, suggest that the future of a language is not always determined by its present precariousness. Let's move now, in the spirit of a long, rambling, sleepy historical monologue, to a topic that we haven't fully addressed yet: the specific experience of the darkness. Not just the cold, the dark. The dark. 40 days. With no sun, the town of Verkhansk sits at about 67.5 degrees north latitude. The town of Oymyakon is at about 63 degrees north. For comparison, the Arctic Circle is at 66.5 degrees north. Both are, in other words, within or very close to the Arctic Circle, and they experience the full range of Arctic light phenomena. In summer, the sun circles the horizon for weeks without setting. In winter, it barely rises or doesn't rise at all. At Verkhansk's latitude, for roughly 40 days around the winter solstice, the sun does not clear the horizon. It is perpetually below the visible edge of the world. There is a diffuse glow around midday, a thin, bluish light that is not quite darkness and not quite day. And then the dark returns. 40 days of no direct sunlight. It's a fact that most people who haven't experienced it find genuinely difficult to imagine. We're accustomed to thinking of a cloudy day as the darkest normal daytime experience. 40 days without the sun rising at all is something categorically different. The physiological effects of this are real and well documented. Human body uses light, particularly light exposure to the eyes, to regulate the circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs sleep-wake cycles, and a range of hormonal processes. In the absence of normal light cycles, the circadian rhythm can desynchronize. Sleep patterns shift. The production of melatonin, the sleep hormone, becomes dysregulated. Serotonin levels, which affect mood, drop in reduced light. Seasonal affective disorder, SAD, is more prevalent at higher latitudes. This is not a mystery. It is a predictable physiological response to reduced light exposure. People in Yakutia have developed cultural and practical responses to the darkness, just as they have to the cold. Artificial lighting is important in ways that go beyond simple convenience. A well-lit indoor space in the depths of the polar night is a psychological necessity as well as a practical one. The tradition of gathering indoors, of telling stories, of communal activities through the long winter nights serves social and psychological functions that are inseparable from the physical fact of the darkness. The Orthodox Christian calendar, which has shaped the cultural calendar of much of Yakutia since Russian contact, provides a structure of observances and celebrations through the winter. The holidays and feast days that mark the passage of the darkest months. These observances give the calendar texture and rhythm. They create occasions for gathering and celebration in the periods when the world outside is inhospitable. There is a particular quality to the winter social life in Yakutia that visitors often describe, a warmth and hospitality that seems, perhaps, amplified by the contrast with the cold and dark outside. When you're inside and warm, and the cold is outside and real and present, the inside becomes more important. The fire, the food, the company, the small domesticities, the tea culture of Yakutia, the elaborate preparation and offering of tea as a central gesture of hospitality reflects this. Tea warms you from inside. Tea is preparation for going out, and it's recovery from coming in. Tea is conversation and pause and welcome. When the outside temperature makes going outside a managed risk, the ritual of tea indoors takes on additional weight. There's also a spiritual dimension to the darkness in traditional Sakha cosmology. The winter in Sakha religion was a time of heightened spiritual activity, the time when spirits were most present and most powerful, when shamanic ceremonies were most necessary. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was a condition of the spirit world's proximity. The ceremonies that marked the winter, the dances, the drumming, the shamanic performances, were responses to this spiritual state. While formal shamanism has largely disappeared from contemporary Yakutia, replaced by Orthodox Christianity in some cases, by secular culture in others, by a modern synthesis that picks and chooses from multiple traditions in many cases, the emotional resonance of the winter darkness as a spiritually significant time has not entirely vanished. It lives in the folk calendar, in the stories, in the ways communities choose to mark the darkest days. The solstice is the turning point, the shortest day. After the solstice, the light begins to return. This return is celebrated implicitly and explicitly across the cultures of the far north. Not dramatically, not with loud festivities, usually, but as a significant moment of transition. The darkness has reached its maximum. From here, day by day, it begins to ease. And then spring comes, which is an experience so dramatic in Yakutia that it deserves its own careful attention. Spring in Yakutia. When the world defrosts, spring in Yakutia is not a gentle season. It doesn't ease in quietly, the way spring does in, say, England or the American Midwest. It arrives abruptly, dramatically, and with a kind of reckless abandon that reflects the enormous pent-up energy of a world that has been held at -50 for months. The temperature can swing dramatically in spring, from -30 to +10 in a matter of weeks. The snow, which has been accumulating since October, begins to melt. This sounds pleasant. It is not entirely pleasant. When several months' worth of frozen snow and ice melt in a compressed window of time, the result is flooding. The rivers of Yakutia, the Lena and its tributaries, freeze solid in winter, and the ice can be several meters thick in the coldest reaches. In spring, as the ice breaks up, it doesn't melt quietly. It breaks. Large slabs of ice, carried by the rising floodwater, grind and crash into each other with a sound that locals describe as like distant artillery. The ice breakup on the Lena is one of the great natural spectacles of the region, and it has practical significance. The timing of the ice breakup determines when river navigation can resume, when ice roads close, when the spring flooding peaks. The floods can be severe. Yakutian settlements along the Lena and other rivers have been flooded repeatedly through history. Yakutsk itself, despite being on a terrace above the floodplain, has experienced flooding events that damaged parts of the city. Smaller river settlements have been completely inundated by spring floods. The 2001 floods in the Lena Basin were among the worst in recorded history, affecting dozens of settlements and causing enormous damage. After the floods, the mud, the active layer, thawing for the first time since October, becomes saturated and soft. Roads that have been reliable all winter become impassable in spring. The transition from winter roads, where frozen rivers and frozen ground provide the main thoroughfares, to summer roads is a period of particular logistical difficulty. The roads are muddy. The rivers are in flood. The helicopters that serve the most remote communities get extra work. Then, just when the mud begins to firm up, the mosquitoes arrive. And then, somehow, in the space of a few weeks, it is summer. The sun is high. The days are 20 hours long. The tundra and taiga have burst into green. Wildflowers are blooming. The temperature might hit 30 degrees. Children are swimming in the river. The contrast with January is so complete, so total, that it might seem like a different place. But it is the same place. The Oymyakon, where the temperature hit minus 71.2 in the winter, is the same Oymyakon where people swim in the river in July. The Lena that carries ice floes in April is the same Lena where river cruises run in August. This is Yakutia. This is the full range of it. This is what it means to live in a place that is truly extreme, not just cold, not just dark, but an entire spectrum of conditions that would individually be newsworthy in most parts of the world, and that in Yakutia simply constitute the year. The agricultural calendar in Yakutia, such as it is, has been precisely calibrated to the short growing season. The potatoes that Yakutian farmers plant are fast maturing varieties, because the frost-free season may be as short as 60 to 90 days. Hay cultivation is intensive during the summer, because horses and cattle will need it through the long winter. The timing of planting and harvesting is a matter of experienced judgment, reading the signs of the season in the sky and the soil and the behavior of local plants and animals. Indigenous phenological knowledge, the traditional ecological understanding of seasonal timing, is extremely precise in Yakutia because it has to be. The spring migrations of birds tell you something. The first emergence of specific plants tells you something. The behavior of fish in the rivers tells you something. This is a calendar written not in dates, but in natural signs, accumulated over generations of careful observation. In recent years, that calendar has been showing signs of disruption. Migration timing has shifted. Ice breakup happens earlier than it used to. Seasons that were predictable within a relatively narrow range are showing more variability. The ecological calendar that indigenous knowledge was calibrated to is in the process of changing, and the knowledge that was calibrated to the old patterns doesn't map perfectly onto the new ones. This is another form of the loss we were discussing earlier, not just cultural loss, but ecological knowledge that no longer quite fits the ecology it was built to describe. But the people of Yakutia are adaptable. They have always been adaptable. The history of the region is, at its core, a history of adaptation to the cold, to the darkness, to colonization, to industrialization, to collectivization, to the post-Soviet chaos, to diamond economy dynamics. The people who have lived in Yakutia have repeatedly shown a capacity for adjustment that makes the rest of us look slightly rigid. Let's take a breath and move into the later parts of our story, the modern Yakutia, the Yakutsk of today, the way this extraordinary place exists in the 21st century. Yakutsk Today. A city on the Permafrost, Yakutsk, is a place that should not exist. And yet here it is. It is, depending on how you count, the largest city in the world built on continuous permafrost. The temperature record for the city itself sits around -64 degrees Celsius in the coldest winters, not the absolute record of Oymyakon or Verkhansk, but still astonishingly cold for a city of 300,000 people. The average temperature in January in Yakutsk is around -40 degrees Celsius. This is the average, not the extreme, the average. And yet, shopping malls, universities, a thriving cultural scene, an opera and ballet theater, a diamond museum with some of the most extraordinary gemstones ever pulled from the earth, an airport with direct flights to Moscow, a McDonald's, or at least there was one until the recent departure of Western fast food chains from Russia. A city. The first Russian fortress at Yakutsk was built in 1632, as we mentioned. The city grew slowly through the 17th and 18th centuries as a center of fur trade administration and a staging point for expeditions eastward. The construction was wooden log buildings, the standard construction of Siberia, and the permafrost was, for a long time, treated as a foundation rather than a problem. This worked for small, light buildings. Traditional log construction is relatively light, and the cold keeps the permafrost frozen enough that small buildings don't sink dramatically. But as the city grew and buildings got larger and heavier, and as central heating made those buildings warmer inside, the permafrost problem became inescapable. The systematic study of permafrost engineering in Yakutsk began in earnest in the Soviet period, driven by the same practical necessity that drove permafrost research generally. You can't build an industrial city on ground that shifts seasonally if you don't understand why and how it shifts. The pile foundation system, the buildings on stilts, was developed and refined through the Soviet decades and is now the standard approach for any substantial construction. Walking through Yakutsk today, you can see buildings at different stages of the pile foundation's effectiveness. Newer buildings, properly engineered with deep piles driven into stable permafrost, sit solidly on their supports. Older buildings, built on shallower piles, or without piles entirely, show varying degrees of the permafrost distress that decades of climate warming have accelerated. Walls crack, floors tilt. In some cases, buildings are abandoned when the damage becomes too extensive. There's a neighborhood in Yakutsk called Zaloga, an older residential area where Soviet-era apartment buildings have been progressively damaged by permafrost thaw and subsidence. Residents of these buildings live with tilted floors, cracked walls, and the ongoing psychological reality of knowing their building is in slow, managed decline. The city has programs to relocate people from the most damaged buildings, but the scale of the problem is large and the resources limited. The infrastructure of the city, sewage, water, power, is adapted for permafrost in ways that are not visible, but that are essential. Underground utilities don't work in permafrost. They can't be buried. So much of the city's utility infrastructure runs above ground, in insulated pipes visible along the streetscape. This gives Yakutsk a particular visual character. The tangle of insulated pipes running along buildings and streets that is the city's circulatory system, kept above ground where it can be maintained, and where it doesn't interact with the frozen ground beneath. The city has a car culture that is necessarily adapted to its climate. Cars in Yakutsk are typically plugged into block heaters overnight to keep the engine block from freezing. In very cold weather, -40 and below, even with a block heater, cars can be difficult to start. Many residents keep their cars running continuously during the coldest periods. Parking garages are heated. The relationship between Yakutsk residents and their vehicles is one of constant vigilance and winter preparation that people in temperate climates would find exhausting. There's a particular kind of fog that develops in Yakutsk in severe cold, and it's not natural fog. It's the collective exhaled breath and vehicle exhaust of a city of 300,000 people meeting temperatures cold enough to instantly condense every bit of moisture in the air. The city creates its own fog, a white miasma that sits over the streets in the coldest weather, reducing visibility and making the outdoor experience even more disorienting. This is called frost smoke by some, and is one of the distinctive sensory experiences of being in a very cold city in winter. The market for cold weather clothing in Yakutsk is unsurprisingly sophisticated and well developed. Local craftspeople continue to produce traditional fur garments, hats, coats, boots, alongside the modern synthetic insulation options. The fur trade is still a part of the regional economy, though at a smaller scale than its historical peak. Fox, sable, mink, and various other furs are worked by local craftspeople. The garments they produce are objects of practical necessity and cultural identity simultaneously. Food markets in Yakutsk offer the full range of local specialties alongside imported goods. The central market is a place where Stroganina vendors set up alongside sellers of frozen horse meat and the various other traditional products. In winter, the market itself is essentially a giant freezer. The cold keeps everything fresh without any mechanical refrigeration. Vendors stand in their stalls wrapped in fur, and the products they sell are frozen solid. And this all seems completely normal to everyone involved. The nightlife of Yakutsk in winter is naturally mostly indoors. Cafes, restaurants, and clubs operate through the coldest months. There is a distinctive pleasure in eating and drinking in a warm space when the temperature outside is -45. The warmth is not just physical comfort, it's contrast. It is felt more intensely for what it's contrasted against. There is also, in Yakutsk, a vibrant film industry. This might genuinely surprise you. The Sakha Cinema. Films from the coldest city, Yakutsk, has a film industry. It has had one for roughly 30 years, and it has produced works that have been shown at international film festivals, and that have built a modest but genuine international reputation for Sakha Cinema. The story of Sakha Cinema begins in the 1990s, in the chaos of the post-Soviet period. The old Soviet film infrastructure had collapsed. State studios were gone or underfunded, but the vacuum created by the collapse of the old system also created space for new voices, new forms, new stories. In Yakutia, a group of filmmakers began making films in the Sakha language about Sakha life and culture, low budget, locally produced, and aimed at local audiences. The audiences responded. Films in the Sakha language about places and characters and stories that Sakha audiences recognized found genuine popularity in Yakutia. The industry grew, slowly and improbably, into something real. By the 2000s and 2010s, Sakha films were being made with increasing production quality, and some of them were being noticed outside Yakutia. The director Dmitry Davidov, whose films work in the tradition of slow, careful, deeply observed rural storytelling, garnered attention at international festivals. Other Sakha directors found their way to international audiences with films that brought the specific texture of Yakutian life, the cold, the landscape, the indigenous culture, to viewers who had never thought about Yakutia before. The genre that became the most commercially successful in Sakha cinema, somewhat unexpectedly, is horror. Sakha horror films, drawing on the rich tradition of shamanism, spirit lore, and the indigenous spiritual universe, have become enormously popular locally and have built a following in wider Russian and even some international audiences. This is not as strange as it might initially seem. The cultural resources for horror are rich. The Sakha universe is populated with powerful and potentially dangerous spirits. The landscape, dark forests, frozen rivers, isolated settlements, the deep polar winter, is atmospherically suited to the genre. And Sakha filmmakers, drawing on these resources, found a language that resonated. The phenomenon of Sakha horror is, among other things, a story of cultural survival through unexpected channels. The spiritual traditions of the Sakha, which were suppressed and officially discouraged through the Soviet period, found their way back into cultural expression through the back door of genre cinema. The spirits came back as movie monsters, which is perhaps not the most dignified of returns, but is still a return. The most commercially successful Sakha horror film. I won't give you the title, because the titles are in Sakha and require a fair amount of context to explain sold-out cinemas in Yakutsk for weeks, and generated a level of local enthusiasm that exceeded anything the local film industry had previously achieved. The lead actress became genuinely locally famous. The film was discussed, debated, and celebrated as a cultural artifact. This is what cultural vitality looks like. Not a museum exhibit, not a UNESCO heritage designation, though those matter too, but a horror film that sells out its premiere and makes people talk about the old stories in new ways. Sakha Cinema is a small but genuine cultural force, and it exists because a specific community decided that their stories were worth telling and worth watching, and because audiences agreed. This is, in a modest way, a hopeful story. Let's move now to something that connects Yakutia to the broader sweep of history more directly. The remarkable fact that Yakutia is a place from which significant scientific discoveries have been made, and from which important historical questions have been answered. Mammoth hunters, ancient DNA, and the questions, the permafrost answers we talked earlier about the mammoths. Let's go deeper. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, is the most famous of the Pleistocene megafauna, and Yakutia is one of the places where their remains are found most frequently. The combination of the animal's historical range, which included Siberia extensively, and the preservation properties of the permafrost, means that Yakutia has produced a remarkable collection of mammoth remains over the decades and centuries. Some of these are bones and tusks. Some are more complete. The most spectacular finds are the frozen carcasses, animals that died, were buried, and were preserved in the permafrost for tens of thousands of years with varying degrees of completeness. The recovery of frozen mammoths from Yakutia goes back centuries. Siberian hunters and herders were finding mammoth tusks and bones in eroded riverbanks, and melting permafrost long before European science took an interest. The local legend around mammoth bones, in some traditions, the animal was believed to be a giant underground creature, and its remains were the bones of creatures that had died by accidentally surfacing. Reflects the long familiarity of indigenous peoples with these remains. For the ivory trade, mammoth tusks have been commercially significant for centuries. The permafrost of Siberia contains an estimated 500,000 to 10 million mammoth individuals. By some estimates, a vast frozen cemetery. Many of their tusks have been recovered by hunters and traders over the centuries, and Siberian ivory has been traded as far as China for hundreds of years. Today, as elephant ivory trade is restricted by international conservation law, Siberian mammoth ivory has become even more commercially significant, a legal alternative whose supply is being somewhat augmented by the thawing permafrost, liberating new specimens. This creates a peculiar dynamic. Climate change is thawing the permafrost. Thawing permafrost is releasing more mammoth remains. More mammoth remains means more available ivory. Some people are, in a macabre sense, economically benefiting from the climate change that is dismantling the ecosystem that preserved the mammoths in the first place. But the scientific value of mammoth specimens from Yakutia has been far more significant than the commercial value of their tusks. The frozen specimens have enabled research that has fundamentally transformed our understanding of these animals and of the Pleistocene world they inhabited. From well-preserved specimens, scientists have extracted ancient DNA, first in fragments, and later, as techniques improved, in quantities sufficient for detailed genetic analysis. The complete mammoth genome has been sequenced. We know from this work what the woolly mammoth was genetically, how it was related to Asian and African elephants, which genetic variants were specific to the mammoth lineage, which genes were responsible for the cold adaptations that made them mammoth rather than elephant. We know that the mammoth's hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen in the blood, was adapted to release oxygen more efficiently at cold temperatures than elephant hemoglobin does. We know that specific genes related to hair growth, fat storage, and cold sensitivity were modified in the mammoth lineage compared to elephants. We have read the molecular blueprint of an animal that has been extinct for several thousand years. This has led to the now famous de-extinction projects. Various scientific teams, most prominently the company Colossal Biosciences, have announced ambitious programs to resurrect something mammoth-like. Not through cloning exactly, because no fully intact and viable mammoth DNA exists, but through genetic engineering of Asian elephant cells to incorporate mammoth-specific genetic variants. The goal is an elephant-mammoth hybrid that can survive in the Siberian cold and, in theory, contribute to the restoration of Pleistocene grassland ecosystems. The science is real, even if the timelines are optimistic. The ethical questions are complex. The ecological questions are even more complex. But the foundation of it all, the preserved specimens, the ancient DNA, the detailed genomic work, sits squarely in Yakutia, in the permafrost that kept these animals intact for 30, 40, 50,000 years. Beyond mammoths, the Yakutian permafrost has yielded remarkable finds in other directions. Ancient horses of several different species, cave lions, multiple specimens with fur preserved. A cave lion cub found in 2015, nicknamed Sparta, was preserved so completely that its body was essentially intact after 28,000 years. Scientists could see the individual hairs of its fur. Its organs were preserved. Its last meal was still partially present in its digestive tract. Ancient plants have been recovered from the permafrost as well. Seeds found in squirrel burrows, 32,000-year-old seeds of the narrow-leafed campion plant, were successfully germinated by Russian scientists in 2012, producing flowering plants from seeds that had been frozen since the Pleistocene. The plants were fertile. They produced seeds. A species that had been reproductively isolated for 32,000 years was briefly returned to biological activity. All of this sits in the permafrost of Yakutia, the world's greatest preservation medium, slowly being liberated by warming temperatures. The scientific opportunity and the climate alarm are inseparable here, each feeding the urgency of the other. There is also a human dimension to the ancient DNA work that connects back to the living people of Yakutia. Ancient human remains from Siberia, including some from Yakutia, have been analyzed for their genetic content, contributing to our understanding of the migrations and population movements that populated northern Asia and through the land bridge of Beringia, the Americas. The genetic ancestry of modern indigenous Siberians is, it turns out, complex. Multiple ancient population movements contributed to the gene pool of the people who live in Yakutia today. The Sakha themselves show a genetic signature that reflects their southerly origins. They are genetically distinct from the Evans and Evinks, who show more typical North Asian ancestry patterns. The genetic history of the region, read from bones and teeth preserved in the permafrost, is a story of human movement and mixture that predates any written record. The permafrost is a library, an unintended, accidental library, built by the cold over tens of thousands of years and being slowly read by the warming world. Let's float now, as the night deepens, towards some of the more personal stories, specific individuals whose lives are woven into the history of Yakutia and who give this large, abstract place a human face. Faces of Yakutia lives in the cold. Let's begin with Pyotr Alexeyev. Pyotr Alexeyev was a Sakha shoemaker born in the mid-19th century, who became one of the most significant political activists of his time. Though this is not the part of his life we're going to dwell on. What is interesting in the context of our story tonight is that Alexeyev, a man who grew up in the conditions of Yakutian cold and poverty, found his way to political radicalism not despite his origins, but in part because of them. The experience of the extreme and unequal conditions of Yakutian life under the Tsarist system informed a worldview that was not content with things as they were. Alexeyev was eventually arrested for his revolutionary activities and sent to hard labor in Siberia, back to the cold, but in much worse conditions than the relative comfort of a shoemaker's life. He died in exile in 1891. His name is commemorated in Yakutsk, but his is a representative story of a pattern. The children of Yakutia, shaped by the conditions of their upbringing, venturing into the wider world and carrying with them the particular perspective that growing up in an extreme place provides. There is Anastasia Petrova, a contemporary Sakha woman. And when I give you a name, I'm giving you a composite, a representative figure assembled from the many stories of real people, rather than a specific individual whose details I am presenting without permission. But the life I'm describing is entirely real in its particulars, because these are the real particulars of lives as lived in Yakutia today. She grew up in a rural community in the Namsky Ulus district, a few hours from Yakutsk by road. Her family kept cattle and horses. In winter, the family spent the long evenings together, her mother sewing, her father maintaining tools and equipment, her grandmother telling the old stories, the fire going in the center of the room. She learned the traditional Sakha dances, the Oymyakon, the round dance performed at Usyak, and she learned some of the older songs. She went to university in Yakutsk to study education. She came back to her home community to teach school. Her students include children who still come from herding families and children whose parents work in diamond mining and children whose parents work in local government. The community is a mixture, as rural communities everywhere are increasingly a mixture of old and new, of people whose lives are continuous with deep tradition, and people whose lives are shaped primarily by the modern economy. She teaches in both Sakha and Russian because both matter. She takes her students outside in winter carefully at appropriate temperatures with appropriate clothing to teach them to read the sky and to identify plants under the snow and to understand the environment that surrounds them. She thinks this is important. She is right. Let's go further back. The first Yakut woman to receive a formal academic education in the European sense was Yuliana Alexeyeva, born in the 1880s. She managed, through a combination of unusual personal circumstances and the intervention of some sympathetic Russians, to receive schooling that was essentially unavailable to Sakha women of her time. She became an activist for women's education and for Sakha cultural rights in the early 20th century. Her life was brief and difficult and made a difference that outlasted her. These are the faces of Yakutia's history that don't make it into most accounts. The people who weren't great Khans or famous explorers or infamous Gulag administrators, but who navigated the extraordinary conditions of their place and time with whatever resources they had. Let's go to an explorer, though, because we should, and because the explorer in question is worth knowing about. Alexander von Middendorf was a Baltic German naturalist who undertook one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions in Siberia in 1842 to 1845. His journey took him across an enormous sweep of Siberian territory, including the far north of Yakutia, and his subsequent reports constituted a major contribution to the scientific understanding of the region. Middendorf was the first scientist to systematically document and characterize the permafrost, the phenomenon that he encountered across Siberia of ground that was frozen to enormous depths year-round. He measured the depth of permafrost in various locations, including a well that had been dug in Yakutsk to a depth of over 100 meters without reaching unfrozen ground. He theorized about the causes of permafrost, correctly identifying that it was a relic of past colder climates, maintained by the current climate. Middendorf was also deeply interested in the people he encountered. His accounts of the Sakha and other Siberian peoples are detailed, respectful by the standards of his time, and observant of the adaptive strategies that he recognized as genuinely impressive. He documented the clothing, the housing, the food practices, the ceremonial life. His observations sit at the beginning of the systematic ethnographic literature on Yakutia. The expedition was physically punishing. Middendorf and his small party traversed terrain that was, in winter, genuinely dangerous, and in summer, plagued by the bogs and mosquitoes and river floods that we've discussed. He contracted serious illness on the journey. Several members of his party died or were badly injured. He came home years later with an enormous collection of specimens, notes, and observations that took years to publish. His report, published as Journey to the Far North and East of Siberia in the 1850s through 1870s, remained the standard scientific reference on many aspects of Siberian natural history for decades. The Permafrost chapter was particularly influential and is considered foundational to the science of geocryology, the study of frozen ground. These are the people, the naturalists, the exiles, the indigenous scholars, the teachers, the herders, who constitute the human fabric of Yakutia's history. The cold is the stage. They are the characters. Let's move toward the end of our journey, though not in any hurry. We have time. Settle deeper in. Let's talk about what Yakutia means in the broader sense, what it represents, what we learn from it. What Yakutia, TEACHESUS here, is what I keep coming back to. After spending this long, slow, cold night in Yakutia, human beings are remarkably good at living in places that should not be livable. This is not a new observation. People have made it before, but Yakutia makes it viscerally concrete in a way that feels important. Because Yakutia is not moderately inhospitable. It is not challenging. It is, by any objective measure, one of the most extreme environments on the inhabited surface of the earth. And people have been not just surviving, but building cultures, raising children, creating art, telling stories, developing science, mining diamonds, and celebrating summer festivals in it for thousands of years. The lesson this teaches is not that human beings are invincible. The cold has killed people in Yakutia. The Gulag killed enormous numbers of people in conditions of deliberate deprivation. The cold does not forgive mistakes. People have died from frostbite, from getting lost, from vehicles failing, from all the things that the extreme cold does to inattentive or unlucky human beings. The cost of the place is real, but the lesson is about adaptability, about the accumulation of knowledge over time, about the way communities build survival systems that are so well tuned to their environments that from outside they look like ordinary life. The children walking to school at -48 are not performing heroism. They are performing the ordinary childhood of their place. What Yakutia also teaches us is something about the relationship between culture and environment. The Sakha culture, its language, its ceremonies, its horse herding practices, its storytelling traditions, was shaped by the specific environment of the Lena River basin at extreme northern latitudes. The culture is not a response to some generic challenging environment. It is a response to this environment. These rivers, these mountains, these specific cold patterns, this particular darkness and light cycle. When the environment changes, as it is changing now, with the permafrost warming and the seasons shifting, the culture built on that environment is affected, not necessarily destroyed, because cultures have a resilience of their own and can adapt, but stressed, challenged to update systems built on assumptions that are changing. This is a version of something happening everywhere, the relationship between cultures and the specific environments that shaped them across a planet whose environments are in relatively rapid flux. The specific version that Yakutia presents permafrost culture in a warming world is particularly visible and particularly dramatic, but it is not unique in kind. Yakutia also teaches us something about the limits of outside understanding. It is easy, from a warm apartment in a temperate city, to look at Yakutia and see hardship. To see the -71, the outhouses, the 30 kilometers between settlements, the school that opens at -48, to see all of this and think, these people are suffering. These people need rescuing. These people would be better off somewhere else. And this perspective, while coming from a genuine concern for well-being, misses something essential. The people of Yakutia are not, by and large, suffering from being in Yakutia. They are living in Yakutia. They are adapted to it, embedded in it, culturally and personally identified with it in ways that make somewhere else not a solution, but a loss. The long history of well-intentioned attempts to move indigenous northern peoples to better climates, or to change their ways of life to be more compatible with European or Russian standards of comfort, has not generally produced happy results. People removed from their landscapes lose something that cannot be replaced by a warmer apartment or a more reliable food supply. The loss is real, even when the replacement is materially better. This doesn't mean that people in Yakutia shouldn't have access to health care and education and economic opportunity. They should. The point is not that everything should stay frozen, metaphorically, in the traditional form. The point is that the people who live there should be the ones deciding how their place changes, because they are the ones who know it. And they do know it. That is the thing that strikes me most when I read the accounts of life in Yakutia, the depth of the local knowledge, the precision and accuracy of the indigenous ecological understanding, the way the culture has encoded over centuries the information needed to live in this place. The Yakutian horse that proves adaptation is possible. The alonko that proves meaning can be made in the deepest cold. Yakutia is not a curiosity. It is not a climate spectacle. It is a place where human beings have made a civilization imperfect, complicated, historically marked by violence and exploitation and resilience in equal measure, and where they continue to live and to adapt and to make tea and light fires and walk to school in the dark. That deserves more than our wonder. It deserves our attention. Equals equals equals.